Hello and welcome to my channel. Welcome to another video from me. So I'm gonna start by explaining why I was on a hiatus again for a very long time. I think I have also explained it in community posts that I have made in the past month and a half or so that I was absent. But basically, as many of you know, we are going through a worldwide economic crisis, and my job is no exception, in the sense that they have basically increased the workload in the past few months, and especially in the past month and a half or so. Basically, I've had to work like sometimes 8 shifts in a row with only one day off. So, and also I have to work like close to 10 hours each time, on top of having other responsibilities that I have on a day-to-day basis. So I really wasn't able to focus much on this channel, definitely not as much as I would have wanted to. And on top of that, in the past 2 weeks, I got sick. So I thought I was just a cold initially, and I treated it with over-the-counter medication. But after about 5 days of, having a runny nose and coughing and having a sore throat, I started losing my voice and I had to get on antibiotics. So basically for the past week or so, I have not had a voice, and even now I'm a little bit hoarse still. So hopefully it will get better eventually. Anyway, it's good enough for me to record something, and so I just wanted to basically update you on why I have been gone. And yes, I am really sorry, and I do apologize to the people who are still waiting for their predictions of 2025. I know I'm like super late. I will get back to working on that series, but I thought since I have been gone for a while, the first video should be something more general that would be for pretty much everyone who wants to watch this video, basically. But I will continue the predictions for 2025. I think I probably will, might as well start the predictions for 2026 right after I finish the series. But anyway, but yeah, I will continue that series as soon as I can. And I really hope to post at least one more video this week, by the end of the week. And it will be predictions for Pisces. That was the one that I was supposed to do next. Anyway. So this is an introduction, and now I'm going to go straight into the topic, which is the fifth house lord through houses, the negative expression. So those of you who have watched, this series or have been on my channel for a while, you know that I've started this series where I talk about house lords going through houses and their different meanings and manifestations. And I have done a video, the part 1, which is about the positive expressions of the fifth house lord through houses. So now I'm going to focus on the potentially negative impact of the fifth house lord through houses. So this especially applies to cases where the fifth house lord is a malefic and or is aspected by malefics. The fifth house lord itself maybe can be, containing malefics or aspected by malefics. And another thing to look at, if, you can find online calculators actually that will give you the Astro-Hitchhiker score. So if the fifth house itself or the fifth house lord have a low Astro-Hitchhiker score, basically that would also tend to show a potentially negative manifestation. And really, in most cases, most people get both negative and positive impacts when it's a mixed house result. So it's pretty rare that you get entirely negative or entirely positive situations with respect to a house lord. But yeah, so that's why it's worth checking both interpretations and seeing how they manifest. And of course, you can determine if you're going to get more of the negative or the positive depending on what transits are activating this house and the house lord at any particular time of life. So I'm going to start with the fifth house lord going into the first house. If this is a negative placement, the potentially negative manifestation can be that your educational years, especially the time up until college degree, right? College including, actually, could have had a negative impact on your health in some way. This could be like, for instance, having a very stressful time in school, having a lot of pressure from parents. This could also be bullying. This could be having a tough relationship with your peers throughout the school years, also in college. This could also be that your education itself, the actual teachings you have received through your education, have somehow negatively impacted your self-concept, your self-confidence, right? So this could be in different ways. It could be, again, having to deal with bullying, having to deal with teachers that were not supportive. It could be the actual teachings, shaming you some way. Like, I can think about situations nowadays where, for instance, white people are being shamed for things that happened like hundreds of years ago. Just as a just as a small example, I can think of that as a potential scenario. But somehow, somehow there could be a potentially negative impact. Another thing that could happen with the fifth house later in life is your children could somehow negatively impact your health. So, for instance, if you're a woman and the lord of the fifth house is Mars, or you have Mars somehow connected to the first or the fifth houses, but it's both of them actually have to be impacted together, I would watch out for a particularly painful birth, right? So a lot of blood loss, potentially things going wrong with the pregnancy. And again, I don't want to plant the seed of negativity here, but I think it's good for people to have a heads up about what could possibly go wrong and take every precaution if they are put in that situation. So aside from that, the fifth house also has to deal with your intestines, your digestive system to some extent, and your cardiovascular system. So all of these things could be potentially afflicted in your health, right? And again, if you want to see periods when you might have problems with these things, you have to look at transits. So when are these houses going to be activated through transits? When the fifth house lord is going through the second house, if this is a negative situation, it shows that your education could negatively impact the relationship with your family of origin. So again, this could be a situation where, I don't know, let's say you were raised in a very traditional family of immigrants who moved from a traditional country to a Western country, and you go to school and you find out that according to the views of the society that you live in, the way that your parents have lived is not the best way to live, for instance, or you're learning different values in school that will put you at odds with your family of origin. That could happen. Another thing is the fifth house also ruling the digestive system, the cardiovascular system. So especially the gut, actually, the fifth house connected to the intestines especially, and everything to do with the digestive system really. And if there is a negative influence here, it could show that you might have some digestive issues that negatively restrict your diet. Like let's say you develop a stomach problem, and because of that, you have to be on a diet that you're not really happy with, right? Another thing that could happen is fifth house is speculative gains as well. So with this placement, if it is a negative, especially if the fifth house is very negative, the fifth house lord, let's say, is a malefic and it's conjunct malefics, or it's aspected by malefics, or there are malefics sitting in the fifth house or the second house, right? And there's a connection between these houses. You could be seeing losses, especially losses of your savings. So I would advise, again, against any significant speculative investments with this placement, unless you take a lot of precautions and you do everything in your power to, get all the documentation that you need, all the information that you need, you calculate the risks. And on top of that, it wouldn't hurt if you check transits to see which transits are potentially more favorable for you to invest your money, for instance. Aside from that, fifth house can also be your children. So children might again cause some kind of arguments or some kind of friction with your family of origin. Again, take it how it resonates. Could be a million scenarios. I don't know. Let's say you don't want your children to be taken care of by your parents, for instance, and that will cause friction with your parents, right? Just an example. Or maybe your spouse doesn't want your child to spend that much time with their grandparents, right? And that causes friction. Something like that. Another thing is your individual expression. If this is a negative impact, your individuality, your creative expression, who you are, your authentic self, may not feel accepted by your family of origin, or somehow it rubs them the wrong way. The family might disapprove of the way that you express yourself, the way that you, maybe everything that has to do with, creative expression, the way you walk, the way you talk, the way you dress, your hobbies, for instance, could piss your family off. Another thing, of course, fifth house is the house of romance. So having this kind of connection being negative, again, could show that your choice of romantic partners can really annoy your family of origin, right? Or can bring you into conflict with them. When the fifth house lord is going into the third house, okay, the house of communication, of younger siblings, of the neighborhood, if it's a negative impact, again, this could show that you might be at odds when it comes to your neighbors. So just to give you an example that I can think about right off the bat, maybe your hobby is to play guitar, for instance, in your free time, and that can get you into arguments with your neighbors because they don't like the noise. Basically, fifth house being all forms of creative self-expression, right? So somehow the way that you express yourself or what you do for fun can rub your neighbors the wrong way. Can also be the same, can be the same scenario with younger siblings. So somehow you could be at odds with younger siblings because of the way you express yourself, your creative expressions. And it can also be people that are related to you, like cousins, like that are connected to you but not very connected to you, like not close first degree relatives. Another thing is the third house represents bravery, right? Your willpower. So if this is a negative situation, it could be that your education or your experiences throughout your educative years, right? So that means up until college degree and included, may have a negative impact on your willpower, your ability to go after what you want, your overall sense of bravery and confidence in yourself. Also your independence. So the third house is very prominent when it comes to, for instance, people who are self-employed, right? People who take big risks have to have a strong third house. But if you have like a negative connection from the fifth to the third, it can show that the experiences you've had throughout your formative years, your school years, whether it's through the teachings that you were given, whether it's relationships that were bad, like bullying from peers or teachers, could negatively impact your ability to fight for what you want. And obviously I'm telling you this because becoming self-aware of all these things helps you become better and actually go for what you want, right? The first step is to become aware of potentially negative imprints that you have in order to grow. Another thing is the fifth house can show the children or your relationship towards children in general, but your children in particular. So once you have children, there could be some kind of arguments happening between your children, or let's say the children will become some kind of a reason of friction between you and your siblings, your younger siblings, maybe even cousins, extended family, and neighbors, right? So again, maybe your child plays very loud music and the neighbors threaten to sue you. Just to give you an example right off the top of my head. Another thing that kind of maybe is a minor issue is fifth house is education. So if there's a negative connection between the fifth and the third houses, this could show that you will have some kind of an annoying commute when it comes to your education. So like, for instance, you go to university in a city that you don't like, or you don't like the commute, or you don't find rent close to the campus, so you have to, I don't know, drive an hour to go to university every day. Random example, but it does happen. Another thing is with the fifth house and the third house, there can be maybe frustrations in general when it comes to traveling, especially short term or short distance travels. There might be, frustrations, but to see the extent to which you will get frustrations, you have to look at more detailed placements, like what kind of planets are sitting in these houses, what aspects are they getting, what their sign placements are, what their nakshatra placements are, what other planets are aspecting the houses themselves. All of these things will paint little nuances and show you exactly how frustrating this might be. And of course, last but not least, it's very important to check transits when it comes to travel. So if these houses are activated, or the lords of the houses are activated, you can expect to maybe experience some kind of unpleasant situations when it comes to traveling, especially traveling for leisure, so not traveling for work. Anyway, so this is pretty much what I can say about the fifth lord and the third. If the fifth house lord is going into the fourth house, and this is a negative situation, the fifth house lord here is going 12 places from itself. So it's already a little bit of a negative connotation. If it is a very negative situation, this can show a really tense relationship with the mother. Most specifically, it actually shows a mother figure that really never accepts you as an individual. So they can be very caring, they can be very loving, but not in an 100% level, these mothers who parents who always treat their kids like their precious little baby, even though the kids are like 45 years old now, and they still talk to them as if they're 5 years old. Obviously, in psychology, you would call them narcissistic mothers. Honestly, I think in most cases that's really what they are. But basically, it's a mother figure that likes the idealized version of you, right? So they have a picture in their heads of who you are, right? They assign a role to you, like you're the youngest child, you're the middle child, or like you're my little munchkin, whatever. But they never actually take the time to get to know you, right? So you never fully feel like they actually see you for who you are, or that you're fully embraced for who you are. And of course, depending on what actual planets are sitting here and what planets are aspecting and the whole circumstances surrounding the fourth and fifth houses and their lords, there will be various degrees of this, right? It can range from minor annoyances or feeling like, okay, my mother tried her best, but she never really understood me, all the way into cases of serious emotional and maybe even physical abuse, right? Depends on what the full picture is. And aside from that, it shows that the education that you receive, because the fifth house is education up until college degree. Fourth house is education up until high school, right? This shows that the education you receive can put you at odds with your mother, with the mother side of the family, with the teachings of the mother, right? With your teachings that you receive through high school. So, I don't know, let's say you have studied a certain methodology of doing mathematics up until you graduated high school. Now you go to college and you find out that something you've been doing for 10 years was wrong, right? Or the way you've been doing something was wrong, or a certain approach was wrong, just to give you an example. This is on a more minor scale, okay? Now, when it comes to the mother, like I said, it could go in the direction of you receiving some teachings that are completely against what your mother taught you to believe in, or how your mother raised you, right? And you start to question your mother. So it can start to create friction with the relationship with the mother, and also the mother side of the family. On a larger scale, this can also create friction with your relationship that you have towards your heritage. So the fourth house is also the homeland. So it could be the relationship towards your homeland, to the way you viewed your country, maybe your background. It might change negatively as a result of your education and your experiences in school. Now, fifth house could be literally the teachings that you receive through a formal form of education, could also be through relationships that you have had towards your peers or your teachers. I don't know, like speaking from personal experience, I don't have this placement, but just to give you an example, I don't know, let's say you have a teacher who is a misogynist, right? You come across a professor who's a misogynist, or let's say in high school you had a teacher as a misogynist, right? And now you go to college and you find out that it's actually, okay, this is a positive example, so never mind, scratch it. But let's think of a negative example as something like, I don't know, you had in college, let's say you come across a teacher that says something negative about maybe your ethnicity or the religious background you come from or something like that, right? And it really gets you thinking to the point where you might view yourself more negatively, or you might start to view your family negatively. And again, somehow it could transpire in the relationship you have with your mother and the mother side of the family. Aside from that, once you have children, right, because fifth house is also children, this could also put you at odds with your mother somehow. It could happen in a million ways. Like, for instance, you don't really want your mother to look after your child, and that could cause her to get angry, right? Could be also that your mother doesn't really like the way you express yourself, again, because fifth house is all forms of self-expression. It's your hobbies, it's what you do for fun. It's also the education itself. So again, it could be that your mother really doesn't approve of what you want to study for a college degree, for instance. The mother doesn't approve of your hobbies or the way you dress or the way you talk or anything that makes you who you are. So again, like I said, there will be various degrees of this depending on what else is going on in the horoscope. It could range from minor annoyances all the way to actual significant abuse. And aside from this, with this placement, especially since the fifth lord is 12 places away from itself, you have to be very careful when it comes to matters of real estate or vehicles. So be very careful of, investing in a property, investing in a new vehicle of any kind, whether it's a car, whether it's an e-bike or anything. Be really careful with the transits, what's going on at the time, because you might be losing money, right? Or you could get scammed out of money. And especially with properties, right? So it's really important to check the transits with this placement, right? To see when the time is right. But again, depending on how negative these placements are, it could be that, potentially a lot of bad luck when it comes to buying property. Like, usually because 12 places away from the fifth house is the placement of loss. This usually can mean something like, let's say you buy a property that you think is going to be a good investment, but for some reason it actually starts to become a loss somehow. Like, it devalues over time, something happens, or again, you get deceived, you're not aware that there are some problems with the property, and you end up losing money. So it's really important to, check the transits, like I said, and also check the details of what the actual rest of the horoscope says about this situation. Okay, if you have the fifth house lord going through the fifth house itself, this normally is a very positive placement, but there are still things that can go wrong if the fifth house lord is very negative, if there are malefics in the fifth house, if there are malefics looking at the fifth house, etc., 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 etc. So if some of the negative impacts, again, is education can actually spoil your thinking, okay? And it may sound like very dramatic, but just to give you an example, again, it could be that you have certain ideas, and let's say you've always had a dream of creating something, I don't know, a business, right? And then you go to college, because fifth house is education up until college degree, and you come across mentalities that tell you that this business is a bad idea, right? That it's going to fail. That, or they give you examples of how this is going to, this has always gone bad in the past or something. And you become discouraged and you start to doubt yourself. You start to doubt the way you think. And it can ultimately decrease your confidence, really. Another way that it can impact you is whether, so irrespective of whether it attacks your way of thinking and your confidence and your ideas, It can also generally attack your self-expression, your ability to express yourself. Like, let's say you've always been kind of a free spirit, you never had any complexes, maybe you had a good time in school up until college, and then you go to college and you come across very bad professors that are very unsupportive, that are hypercritical, or students maybe that bully you some way or another, although I think in college it's very unlikely that you will go through bullying. But just to give an example, right, of course the same thing could happen in high school, for instance, right, because fifth house is education up until college degree, right, including college degree. So yeah, in fact, according to some people, it's including master's degree, right? But somewhere along those lines, like college, master's, right? Once you get to PhD, that's the ninth house. So anyway, basically somehow the educational system could have a negative impact on your ability to express yourself creatively, freely, and authentically, most importantly, right? And aside from that, this can also show that your child is going to be someone with a very strong personality, so you might become at odds with the child. Or somehow having a child, again, could impede your self-expression. Obviously, for a lot of women, that's the case, for instance, right? Once you have a child, a lot of women, for instance, will be too tired to do the things that they used to do before. Like maybe they used to go to the spa every week and now they only go like once every 2 months or something, right? So anything that you do for fun as well, fifth house is impacted by potentially having a child. Of course, fifth house is also speculative gains. And so when the fifth house is in the fifth and it's a negative situation, this can show a lot of losses financially. So you have to be really careful when it comes to where you invest your money, especially if you plan on doing, stock market investments. You have to do a lot of research. You have to make sure that you get a good broker, and also it wouldn't hurt if you check your astrological transits, right, to make sure that you minimize the risks. Because with this placement, there is a chance that a lot of losses will happen. And then the fifth house is also digestive system. The digestive system, and it's also indirectly connected to weight. So what you see a lot of the times is if the Lord of the fifth house, or again, anything surrounding the fifth house, is particularly negative, this could show a situation where someone struggles a lot with their weight. This can also show potentially digestive issues. A lot has to be seen again from the rest of the horoscope, and especially particular configuration surrounding the fifth house itself. Same thing in a way with the cardiovascular system. So fifth house is connected to the heart, the cardiovascular system, because it's connected to Leo and the sun. So if you have negative, again, if you have malefic sitting here, you need to watch out for potential cardiovascular problems, right? Heart problems. And aside from this, it can also show that when you yourself want to teach, that you might struggle with getting your ideas accepted or your point of view accepted. You might meet with a lot of opposition. Obviously, this doesn't mean never express your ideas. That's not what I'm trying to say. But this could happen, right? So you might meet with some opposition, with some, not so, people not being that open-minded to your perspective. So you have to fight maybe a little bit harder than others to get your ideas across. And this would be particularly emphasized if there's also some kind of a connection between the fifth house and Mercury or the third house. Okay, aside from this, when the fifth house lord is going into the sixth house, the potentially negative impact here, so it's going second placements from itself actually, so it's not that bad when it comes to looking at the, house positions, but the potential negative impact here is especially connected to health, because the sixth house is connected to health very much so. So fifth house is connected to the cardiovascular system, the digestive system, right? So issues connecting these systems might become prevalent, especially during the transits that activate these houses or the house lords. both of them, especially when they are both activated by negative transits or through dashas or mahadashas, you might have some flare-ups of health problems, right? Aside from that, sixth house is also the house of competition, of enemies. So, and the fifth house is education up until college degree, according to some people, even including master's degree, right? So this can show a lot of negative situations involving competition. You will have to deal with a lot of competition when it comes to your education. So let's say you want to become, I don't know, a neurosurgeon or something, obviously, or you want to go for a field that is highly competitive. You will have to come across a lot of competition. You will have to really, really fight hard to get into that study program, right? And overcome a lot of competitors. And then also you could just end up being in a very competitive environment, especially when it comes to your education. So, to some extent, okay, it can also apply to your work environment because sixth house is also your job. So if you become employed as opposed to self-employed, you might also find that you are going to be in a job where you're constantly forced to study, right? To keep up to date with new information. Very competitive fields. So this is a potentially negative impact, okay? Aside from that, fifth house lord going into the sixth can also show potential problems with pets. Like you really want to have a pet, but something always happens that ruins the situation, or I don't know, creates some kind of unexpected situations. Maybe the pet has health problems. Maybe, I don't know, the landlord doesn't want to accept the pet anymore. Stuff like that, so you could run into quite your fair share of obstacles when it comes to keeping pets. Aside from this, fifth house being the house of creativity and self-expression, it could put you at odds with your work environment. So your peers, your coworkers may not appreciate, your coworkers or your bosses, right? May not appreciate the way you express yourself, the way you dress, maybe the way you talk. When you're just being your authentic self, you just feel like you're not really being accepted at the workplace. Another thing, kind of going in the same direction, is the fifth house is also your ideas, your way of viewing things, right? Your points of view. So again, your points of view, your ideas may not be easily accepted at work, right? You feel like maybe you come up with this great creative idea and you go to your boss, you're very excited to talk about it, and they shut you down, right? Or they immediately act like, or maybe they don't even consider it, right? And again, this is not to say that you should not express your ideas. I'm just giving you the heads up that there might be potential resistance and opposition. So you would have to work a little bit harder than the average person to get your ideas across at the workplace. Of course, there will be various degrees of this depending on what else is going on in the horoscope. So depending on what planets are actually involved, how much negativity is going around, the fifth and the sixth houses, a bunch of things, right? So it is recommended. And then, of course, last but not least, you want to look for transits when these things are going to be activated. Aside from this, fifth house is your children as well, and relationship with your children. So your children, okay, I kind of feel bad about saying this, but there's no way around it. The truth is that with this placement, again, if there's enough negativity surrounding these houses, there will be potentially a difficult relationship with your child, right? The child could become, in some way, you might view them as an enemy, or you might view them as a competition in some way. Although I really hope not, but, it depends on the situation. I don't know, but usually it's narcissistic parents who really compete with their children, but I'm not, it may not be like that. I don't know. For instance, you and your child could be working in the same field, and you might find yourself somehow competing with them, directly or indirectly, or you're comparing to them without even wanting to. You can't help it, for instance, right? So there might be some kind of friction, competition, and a lot of arguments with your child, right? And another thing is that because of your child, you could get into conflicts when it comes to your place of employment, right? So a very classic example of this, of course, would be a woman who wants to take maternity leave, right? And you have a hard time taking one because your boss or usually it's your boss because your coworkers wouldn't care, right? But yeah, your boss doesn't really want to give you a maternity or doesn't, is trying to make things hard for you, right? So, and again, I hate giving bad news or something, but it is worth taking into account and taking every precaution, right? Um, that's the whole point of learning astrology, to kind of, anticipate what might happen. Anyway, yes, so these are the main things. Another thing, though, another way to look at it is the fifth house, because again, it's self-expression, it's things that you love, right? It's things you love to do. There could be a negative impact on your health because of the things you love to do. So whether it's your hobbies, maybe, usually with the fifth house, it's not food, but it could also be food, especially if the second house is also somehow involved, or certain nakshatras are somehow involved, like Kritika or Punarvasu. Anyway, but yes, it could be like, I don't know, you have bad eating habits, right, that will make you sick, or it could be taking recreational drugs that will impact your health. I don't know. It could be maybe having a risky hobby like paragliding or bungee jumping, heaven forbid, right? You don't want to break something doing those things. It could be hobbies, especially if there's something connected to animals, because sixth house is about pets and stuff, right? You could run into something negative, like, I don't know, a dog will bite you. You're working at a dog shelter and you might get bitten by dogs like every month or something. And again, as usual, you have to check transits for more specific timing situations, right? Okay. This is what I could say about the sixth house. Now, if the fifth house lord is going into the seventh house, which is the house of the spouse, of partnerships, of audiences, it's the house of the other. When this is, particularly negative, obviously this could be a friction with the spouse, right? Because the fifth house lord is going 3 places away from itself, right? 5, 6, 7, yeah. 3 placements away from itself. This can show you will have a spouse that is very headstrong, and you can be very headstrong, and you butt heads, really, when it comes to making decisions together, right? So there could be some friction going on because you're both very independent, very individualistic. Aside from this, there can also be situations where your spouse is argumentative, in various ways. But again, for this, you would have to also see some sixth house situations involved, right? Some sixth house influence involved, or Mars being involved with the fifth and the seventh houses. But aside from this, generally, there might be some kind of a challenge with the spouse, or it could be that see, here's the thing. This is a typical love marriage aspect. And those of you who have watched my channel for a while, or you have studied astrology more in depth, you already know this, right? So connections between the fifth and the seventh houses, these are the strongest connections that signify a love marriage, which is what the Western world considers the normal way of dating, right? So you meet someone, you fall in love, you date for a while, and then you get married and start a family, right? So this is a typical aspect for this. So on the one hand, even when it's negative, it does have that potentially positive connotation that, hey, you're meant to marry someone that you choose as opposed to someone that is chosen for you. But on the other hand, when this is a negative placement, it can show that you might make a bad decision, at least at some point with one relationship, right? Again, you would have to look at transits to see when this is, happening, because you might still make the wrong choice. Yeah, you might end up in a relationship where you think that this is the one for you, and somehow it goes bad, right? Very bad. I've seen this placement actually with people who have gotten in relationships with narcissists, and have had to break up, and they thought they were madly in love, and this was the person for them, and then they woke up and they learned better, right? And then the next relationships are a lot happier, right? Just to give an example. So this is what happens when you have a negative configuration, or you have malefics in either the fifth or the seventh houses. Aside from this, right, in general, it can show that your hobbies, what you do for fun, your definition of fun is somehow at odds with your husband or your wife, right? Your spouse, whatever the spouse is, right? So this means, I don't know, maybe you collect stamps and it drives your partner insane. They don't understand it. They are annoyed by it, right? They may not be particularly supportive. Or you could sometimes, worst case scenario, feel like you're not fully accepted by your partner. Like, there are parts of you that they don't really like that much or they don't appreciate that much, right? So there could be, again, the degrees of negativity would have to be checked more in depth in with respect to what's going on in the full horoscope, and also checking transits to see when things are going to be particularly likely to go wrong. Aside from this, when it comes to addressing an audience, you might find it hard to get acceptance because the fifth house is creative self-expression, authentic expression. Seventh house is the house of the others, the audience, right? Hitler had a very heavy seventh house, for instance, right? So people who generally are good at coming, getting their ideas across to an audience, it can be very convincing. They have a very strong seventh house. But if you also have some negative impacts, it shows that there might be situations where, again, your ideas are not that easily accepted, or you might get, criticisms for the way you think or the way you express yourself, because, again, fifth house is your authentic self. It's also your ideas in general, your thoughts, your ideas. So, yeah, that could happen. Another thing is seventh house is partnerships. And again, so potentially negative situations involving business partnerships could happen as well. Being in arguments with your business partner, conflicts, or especially, again, in matters connected to the fifth house. So fifth house, again, is creative self-expression, it's education, it's children. So I don't know, your relationship to your child could put you at odds with the business partner or the romantic partner, right? Especially since nowadays many people date once they already have children. That's something to take into account definitely with these placements. Another thing is fifth house is speculative gains. Okay, so if you are in a partnership-based business especially, or if you are in any kind of a business, because seventh house is one of the business houses, it does generally signify partnership-based business, but it also can refer to people who have a business where they work in one-to-one situations with people. So, like, for instance, being a psychotherapist, right? Or any kind of a consultant where you have to work with people in one-to-one situations, right? You could be self-employed, have kind of like a business of one person. And yeah, you could see these kinds of scenarios where there might be potential disagreements with your clients, for instance, right? Especially when these houses are activated through transits or dashas and antardashas. And again, with speculative gains, it's important to check how you invest your money, especially when it comes to your business, right? So you could run into losing money if you make the wrong investments, and I'm talking here especially about high risk investments. So fifth house, like I said, is speculative gains, right? So let's say, I don't know, you take your profit from your business and you think it's a good idea to invest it in stocks and bonds or something. It's really important that you do your research, you minimize, risk, and you talk to a good broker before you make any kind of decisions, because especially if the transits are activating it, there are high chances of losses happening. Another thing here is seventh house is also house of foreigners, foreign countries. So again, there might be situations where your way of expressing yourself could rub people the wrong way. Another thing is even when traveling, right? So when you are traveling, you might have some kind of bad encounters involving foreigners. Aside from this, okay, when the fifth house lord is going into the eighth house, so it's going 4 placements away from itself. Both the eighth house and the fifth house are connected to money, one way or another. When this is a negative thing, and again, eighth house is about managing other people's finances or situations where you're making use of other people's money. So that's why the eighth house is very much connected to investments, banking, taking loans, giving loans. Also managing other people's money, working in insurance, stuff like that, right? Fifth house, right, can show speculative gains. So gaining from investments, right? Also, fifth house is connected to education, children, creative self-expression. And when you have a negative connection between these two houses, you have to be really careful in all these matters, especially when it comes to money matters involving your insurance, involving taking loans, giving loans. Be really careful because you might be losing money. So you have to really watch the transits that are going on at any particular time, right? And eighth house, again, so like just to give you an example, a classic example, which you see or you hear about nowadays, at least from some countries, is investing in education, right? Let's say you take a huge loan to get a college degree, you find out that the college degree is not that helpful in getting you a job, and you're stuck with the debt, right? That's a classic example. Because again, fifth house, like I said, could be children, could be education, could be self-expression. So again, also with children, maybe you take a loan for your child's education and they drop out of college and you're stuck with the debt, right? So this is important to take into account, to plan ahead, giving you a heads up so you can make better decisions. Same thing with your hobbies. So I don't know, let's say, speaking for myself, for instance, I like fish tanks, and the fish tanks are, a pretty expensive hobby, especially in today's world, which is going through not the best economic situation. And I don't know, like, let's say you invest, I were to invest money into buying some huge fish tank and then it cracks, right? It's a loss of money. So you could get into debt on behalf, quote unquote, of your hobbies. And travels as well. Fifth house is traveling for fun, right? Also foreign languages. So eighth house is about foreign languages, countries where foreign languages are being spoken. So again, you could incur debt because you want to learn a foreign language and you pay for a course, right? So yeah, make sure that you read all the fine print before you sign any contract and, take any loan or anything like that, so that you minimize risks, basically. Another thing is eighth house is the in-laws, and fifth house again is your child. Well, among many things. Again, it's also your self-expression, your hobbies. So you could be having some difficult situations with your in-laws, or the parents of your partner, right? Because nowadays many people are not necessarily married legally, but it's the parents of your partner, right? You could be running into problems with them, arguments, especially on behalf of your child, or maybe they don't approve of your hobbies, maybe they don't approve of your education, right? Fifth house. Maybe they don't approve of the way you express yourself, the way you dress, right? The way you behave when you feel like you're just your authentic self, and they're frowning at you, right? So you feel one way or another that they're not fully accepting of you. Eighth house is also psychology, right? So psychology, sexuality, mental health. So a connection between the fifth and the eighth house. Worst case scenario, fifth house is also romance. So what this can show is your relationships, you could have romantic relationships that actively damage your mental health. So again, there will be various degrees of this depending on how prominent the eighth house lord is and how malefic or not malefic it is, right? The influences surrounding the eighth and the fifth houses. But you could have a kind of situation where, at least at one point in your life, I'm not going to say that it's, absolutely compulsory that everyone who has this configuration is going to have a very bad relationship at least once in life. This is why you have to pay attention, right? Pay attention to your configuration so that you can be more self-aware and make the right decisions for you. And also, it helps to pay attention to transits always. See what transits are active, let's say, at the time that you are dating a person. And if you already have a bad feeling, it's a sign that you should probably not date that person. Because with the eighth house, again, so you could have relationships that in a negative way transform your life, right? So you could have a romantic relationship that makes you imbalanced emotionally and psychologically, that creates a lot of crisis situations, a lot of drama, right? Aside from that, with respect to your mentality, so it could be that your thoughts themselves are somehow making you sick, could bring about mental issues, or could bring about sexual issues. Like, I don't know, you were raised with very puritanical views, and this keeps you from having a healthy attitude towards sexuality, just to give you an example. Or it could be mental health. Like, for instance, you have a mind that is hyperactive, or maybe the way you were educated, because of your experiences in education up until college degree, right, as shown by the fifth house, have set you up to develop anxiety, right? Like, maybe you went through bullying at school. Maybe you had a lot of lack of support for who you were as an individual. You didn't feel fully accepted. And now, because of this, you develop mental problems. Okay, that's pretty much what I can say about this placement. Now, if the fifth house lord is going into the ninth house, if this is a negative placement, so here the fifth house is going 5 places from itself. So in a way, the ninth house is actually the, higher octave or a higher expression of the fifth house energy. It's the bavad bhavam, right? So in this case, if it's negative, the main issue will be with education. Ninth house is higher education, it's belief systems, it's religious beliefs, right? Any kind of belief system, actually. It's philosophical views, how you view the world or how you think about life in general, right? So your overview of things, like when it comes to deeper philosophical topics. It's also higher education, meaning PhD and above, like specialized courses. It's also long-term, long-distance travel. So when you have a connection between the fifth and the ninth houses, this could show that you will have negative experiences involving education, right? So either education, or it could be also your father's teachings as well. It could be that your father does not approve of the way that you express yourself, does not approve of your choice of education or career. And because the fifth house, again, is your authentic self. So whenever you're being yourself and you're doing what you love, it could be that your father is not accepting of that. And again, depending on specific circumstances within individual horoscopes, this could range from minor annoyances to actual abuse. So you have to look at the big picture as usual. The same thing could be seen when it comes to gurus, teachers, right? So anyone who's kind of like a mentor figure in your life, there could be disapproval of your ideas, disapproval of your creative ideas, creative expression, yes, including, like I said, the way you walk, the way you talk, the way you express yourself in any way, right? Or maybe your hobbies, right? Like maybe you have a hobby, I don't know, being a biker or something, and your father doesn't approve of it, right? Another way to look at it is fifth house is speculative gains, ninth house, higher education. So again, this could be a situation as well where you might end up losing money because of pursuing higher education, right? Or getting yourself into a significant amount of debt because of this. Aside from this, it could be that your education puts you at odds with the teachings of the father religiously. So let's say, I don't know, you are raised in a Orthodox Christian family, or highly religious family, right? And now you go to university and you learn all kinds of things that will basically contradict what you were raised with, what your father raised you to believe, right? So that can put you at odds with the father's teachings and get you into arguments with the father, right? And make you kind of rebel against your religion. That could be a thing. This can also show that what you learn or your experiences in education up until college level, right, because that's the fifth house, whatever you have gone through up until that level can have a negative impact on your worldview. And by negative, I mean things that might act against you, right? Instead of helping you achieve your goals, your thoughts, and the things you've learned, or the things you have experienced. I'm talking including things like having gone through bullying in school or having had professors who criticized you, right, could somehow negatively impact your faith in life, can impact your desire to pursue a higher education. Like, just to give you a random example, maybe you always wanted to get a PhD in chemistry or something, but then you get to college and you have a horribly critical, bullying professor, right, that always puts you down, that doesn't acknowledge your talent. And you decide that, because of this, I'm not going to pursue a PhD because this person obviously thinks that I don't have the potential to do that, right? Or even if you get to that point, if you don't get to the point where you cancel your plans, it still negatively impacts you. Like, now on top of, dealing with the regular competition of getting a PhD, you also have to have this internal dialogue with, the voices in your head that tell you may not be good enough, right, to make it. So this is one way to look at it, yes. And also when it comes to travel, especially when you're traveling for fun or you're traveling for religious purposes like a pilgrimage, there might be potential annoyances, right? So, and again, to see to which extent they can go, you would have to look at more particular and personal horoscope configurations. But yeah, this is pretty much what I can say about 5th house lord going into the 9th house, I think. Oh, there's one more thing, which is, again, children, right? So 5th house lord is your children. This is interesting, actually. When it comes to children, there could be a conflict between your first and second child. So you might be annoyed by their constant bickering and fighting. Aside from that, when it comes to your children, you may not agree, or like somehow there could be some kind of again, argument happening between your child's personality or something and your belief system. So like having a child could somehow negatively impact your belief system, the way you view the world, and or again, your attitude towards your father's teachings, right? Or teachings of your gurus, teachers, religious leaders, etc. Yeah, okay, this is pretty much what I can say about this placement. So moving on to the 5th house lord going into the 10th house in the natal horoscope, and what are the potentially negative impacts of this. So in this situation, the 5th house lord is going 6 placements away from itself. So that already kind of shows a potentially difficult placement, right? Because the 6th placement from anything tends to show more conflict, more challenges showing up. And if on top of this natural order, you also have, 5th house occupied by malefics, 10th house occupied by malefics, or the 5th and 10th lords being aspected by malefics and being in a not very good dignity, then you will have some of the more negative impacts and expressions of this placement. So in this situation, since the 5th house is self-expression, it shows what you love to do for a living. Well, not just for a living, but yes, it shows what you love to do in general, right? So your hobbies, your passion projects. It also shows how you express yourself, your authentic self, and everything that makes you happy, basically. It's the heart chakra, right? So everything that stimulates you, makes you feel passionate, in touch with life, and purposeful is the 5th house, right? And when there's a negative connection to the 10th house, this can show that your career will somehow stifle your creativity, or you will have the misfortune, at least for a while, again, if this is a negative placement, of going through bad jobs and bad professional trajectories that don't really support your authentic self, that make you feel like you're not really fulfilling yourself, or that worst case scenario, you cannot stay true to yourself, right? Of course, nowadays, it can also definitely show a situation where your education doesn't really help your profession, right? Because the 5th house is about education up until college degree or master's degree, depending on some on which astrologer you ask, right? And the 10th house is the house of career and social status, right? So when there's a negative connection between these two houses, it can show that you might not be able to find a profession that suits your education, or you might feel one way or another that you've wasted your time on the education that you have gotten. Another way to look at it is you could be in a profession where you are constantly required to educate yourself, right? A very challenging, fast-growing profession, which nowadays is many, if not most, professions, really, because with the way the technology is progressing, right, a lot of people find themselves happy to not happy, but they find themselves needing to keep up to date, right, with all the newest changes in technologies. And unless you're like a stonemason or a potter, or some of these more traditional professions, or maybe a cook, you won't have to like stay up to date with technology and keep doing courses maybe. But in most professions, especially the ones that are impacted by technology, people have to keep studying throughout their entire professional life, right? So it could show this kind of a professional trajectory where you're constantly pressured to stay up to date, right? You might have to spend money on courses, for instance. And speaking of spending money, with the 5th house showing speculative gains going into the 10th house, this could also show a situation where you might feel like you have made some kind of a bad investment in your career, right? So again, mostly this makes me think of education. Like you might feel like you've paid too much money for an educational program and you're not really fully reaping the rewards that you thought you would in exchange for your investment. Another way to look at it with the 5th house is there could be some ups and downs in the career, right? Some sudden situations that you don't foresee. Aside from that, 5th house is children as well, your children in particular, but also how you relate to children in general. So if you are working in a field where you have to work with children, this could show potentially negative situations, negative experiences. So, for instance, if you're a teacher and you have to work with kids, you might go through a lot of difficult situations, dealing with difficult students. Pretty much. That's the way to look at it. If, on the other hand, this shows your own child, right, or you have your own child, this could also be a situation where having a child somehow negatively impacts your career. Obviously, for a woman, most of the times that happens when they have children and they're kind of forced to get out of the workforce, right, at least for a while, and then their career could take a hit, or maybe they're pressured to quit a job that they would have loved to keep otherwise, right, just to be able to take care of the child. That would be a very classical scenario, right? But there could be like a million different scenarios by which, having a child may somehow detrimentally influence your career trajectory. Another way to look at it is the child could somehow negatively impact your social status. That's another thing, because 10th house is social status in the way that you are viewed in the world. So, I don't know, you could have like a troublemaker child that, brings you a lot of negative attention, for instance. But as I have mentioned with pretty much all the other placements, in order to see more details, more nuances about what exactly is going to happen in each scenario, you would have to look at the full picture, look at the full horoscope. And of course, it's always important to check transits as well. Usually with a positive scenario, you're able to turn a hobby into a career trajectory. With a negative scenario, you might be struggling a bit. It's not that you're never going to be able to turn a hobby into a career, but you might be able to do so after overcoming a lot of obstacles, right? As shown by 5th house going 6 placements away from itself. So a lot of obstacles, a lot of competition, and eventually you will make it after, like I said, a lot of effort, right? Aside from this, the 10th house is also the father figure, the relationship with the father, and especially relates to the father's social status and position, right? And the way that they somehow shape your behavior in society and also the way that you feel about career. So when the fifth house is negative and it's going into the 10th house, this could also show some conflicts going on with the father, can also show conflicts going on with authority figures as well. 10th house can be the state, can also be any kind of authority figure, whether it's your boss at work, right? Or any kind of authority figure, really. So fifth house going there being negative could show conflicts with these kinds of figures. Also, with respect to the relationship to the father figure, this could be a scenario where you don't feel like the father ever really encouraged you to be yourself, maybe didn't really accept your true self. As I have also mentioned in the fifth house going into the fourth house scenario, this is one of those scenarios, one of those configurations where the relationship to one of the parents is impacted. And depending on what else is going on in the horoscope, this could range from, minor annoyances, or it could go all the way into actual abuse of various kinds, right? So, I don't know, having a father figure that was really bullying you, that put you down for being yourself, that never really approved of you expressing yourself, being your authentic self and all that. Same thing could happen with romance. So, fifth house is also the house of romance. Not so much marriage, which is more of the seventh house territory. With the fifth house, this is about dating, it's about affairs, right? It's about romance, basically, in one word. So relationships that could be also maybe long term, but they're more of an informal situation, not as committed as a marriage, right? So when the fifth house lord is negative going into the 10th house, this again can show that your father figure doesn't approve of your romantic partners. It can show that the romance that you have could negatively impact your career and or your social status. And yeah, so I mean, one classic example of this would be having an office romance, but it doesn't necessarily have to be the case, right? It could just be, I don't know, whatever, like maybe your coworkers or your boss don't really like your partner. And somehow, or maybe the partner works for a competitor, sorry. So, because of that, you get gossip at the office, right? There could be all kinds of scenarios happening. If the fifth house lord is going into the 11th house, this is the house of society. It's the gains from the career. It's basically society at large, right? So how do you relate towards people in general, people, acquaintances, older siblings as well, friends. It also shows how you relate to large groups of people, right? How are you perceived on a grand scale? So when the fifth house lord is negative, or when there's some kind of negativity surrounding the 5th or 11th houses, when there's a connection here, this can be a kind of scenario where, again, you might find yourself in conflict with friends. Worst case scenario, you could have a situation of, friends becoming enemies. You could have a situation of a lot of fake friends, right? So people who don't fully accept you as an individual. They don't really make you feel like you can be yourself around them. Like, you can keep them as friends as long as you don't get too close. They may not fully support you. And on the other hand, this can also show, because the 11th house is the second from the 10th house, right? It shows the gains from career. When the 5th house is negatively impacting the 11th house, you could have a situation where your personality, your basic way of being somehow is detrimentally impacting your ability to make money. So, and especially from a socially acceptable perspective, like you might find that your way of being is somehow at odds with social expectations, right? So because of that, it's more difficult to get approval. Another thing is 5th house is your ideas. So when it comes to 5th house lord going into the 11th house, you might have a hard time, getting your ideas accepted by large audiences. it also tends to show that your elder siblings, again, there could be some kind of a karmic connection there with an elder sibling. So you could have elder siblings that, again, don't fully support you as a person, don't really allow you to be your authentic self. You feel like you always have to maybe wear a mask when you are around them. And on top of that, because of the seventh house, this could be like an enmity situation, right? So you could get direct opposition from the siblings. Since the fifth house is also your children or relationships towards children in general, this can show that once you have children, your children could put you at odds with society at large in some way. So a typical way to look at this would be that once you have a child, your social life will suffer, right? Or maybe the child somehow will make it difficult for you to have a social life, either because they're taking up too much of your time, or because maybe the child is, I don't know, has a difficult temperament, which makes other people look at you in, a weird way or in a negative way. Aside from that, 11th house is also humanitarian attitudes, right? So your attitudes towards society at large, how open you are towards helping others, giving to the brotherhood of man sort of thing, right? So having this kind of broad view of society and humanity as a whole, right? So when you have the fifth house negatively impacting the 11th house, you could have a negative view towards humanitarian actions, right? So for instance, you could be very mistrusting of charity organizations. You don't really like the idea of supporting charity, right? You might have this very kind of negative attitude, like all charities are about ripping you off. Right? Or you just don't care. You don't think about the greater good at all, right? So this is not so much a negative impact on you as it is on the world, but indirectly it also comes back to haunt you in the grand scheme of things, because if you have these kinds of attitudes, there could be opportunities that you're missing out on, or there could be conflicts that you might find yourself in, depending on what your career is and, the rest of your life areas are. But yeah, having a generally kind of a pessimistic view, a negative view on charity, that could be a thing. And also, not really caring too much about making the world a better place. On top of that, the fifth house is romantic partners, it's romance, dating, right? So when there's a negative influence of the fifth house, when the Lord is going through the 11th house, this could show conflicts with your elder siblings and or your friends and acquaintances on or at the, I don't know how to express it. I feel like I've forgotten words since I last recorded a video. Because of the relationship that you have with your romantic partner, right? So in other words, your entourage may not be very approving of your romantic partners, your romantic relationships, and you might find yourself at odds with these groups of people because of the person you're dating. And aside from this, so this is pretty much what I can say about fifth house Lord going into the 11th house. So last but not least, when the fifth house Lord is going into the 12th house and it's a negative situation. Now, 12th house is by itself, not in and of itself is not a very positive house. It's the house of losses. And then on top of that, fifth house Lord going into the 12th is going 8 placements from itself. So there's a double kind of negative connotation. That does not mean that there cannot be positive expressions, of course, but I'm focusing on the negatives here. So a negative could definitely be that your education, right, your thought patterns, but especially your experiences throughout education up until college degree or master's degree, depending on which astrologer you ask. But fifth house is somewhere around that time frame of like college or master's degree, right? Level of education. So negative impact on spirituality, right? So let's say you could grow up being a spiritual person or a religious person, but then you go to university and you are indoctrinated to be, I don't know, a communist, right? A hardcore atheist, and you completely turn away from spirituality. Now, is this a purely negative impact? It depends on how you look at it, but of course there could be negative impacts to this because generally people, again, this is an entire philosophical discussion in and of itself, but I think people in general need faith in order to be healthy, really, mentally and emotionally. But with the fifth house lord negatively impacting the 12th, you could have situations of loss of faith on account of your education, basically, right? Or experiences that you have had during your education time. So maybe it wasn't the teachings themselves, but maybe some painful experiences that you've gone through that have made you question things, like being bullied, I don't know, by peers or by professors, or something that made you bitter and angry to some extent, right? Another way to look at it is because the 12th house is connected to loss, the 8th house is connected to transformation. 5th house is also the romantic partners, the people that you date, the people you have romance with, not so much marriage because that's more the 7th house territory. But with 5th house, there's romance, right? People that you're dating but you're not married to. And when you have this placement with the 12th house, it could show sudden losses of relationships for reasons that maybe are not fully understood by you, or situations where you just feel like you were not to blame at all, that seem really unfair, and yet the relationship dissolves for one reason or another. And the 12th house is also connected to long distance or long-term travel. So in this situation, for instance, you could be going to travel abroad to study, for instance, which can happen very easily with the fifth house lord going into the 12th. But if you have a negative energy surrounding these houses, you might find yourself at a loss, basically, for doing so. So you could be going through some negative experiences while going abroad to travel. You might find that it wasn't all that you have expected, or for some reason it might seem like it's not paying off later down the line, right? Like maybe you go for a master's degree abroad, and you think to yourself that this is going to open up your horizons and get you a good job, but you graduate and then you're not able to find a job for a year or something like that, right? So you could see situations like that happening. But as I've mentioned with all the other placements, I think basically with astrology you always have to look at all the minute details in a horoscope, right? Because it's a game of nuances. So it could range from minor annoyances to catastrophically traumatic experiences, right? Especially since we have a little bit of an 8th house theme here, because like I said, 5th house lord is going 8 placements away from itself, right? This is one thing to look at. Now, 5th house is also your thought processes. It's also your self-expression, your hobbies, what you do for fun. And when it's going into the 12th house, which is the house of sleep, among other things, it can show that your thought processes, your hobbies are somehow keeping you from having good rest. So, I don't know, if your hobbies are gaming and you are gaming all day and all night, obviously you're not going to be getting good amounts of sleep. On the other hand, if you are a person who's very prone to anxiety, a lot of worrying, right, and you are torturing yourself with repeated thoughts that are very negative and catastrophic scenarios, that's going to keep you from sleeping as well. Aside from that, 5th house can also be connected to health issues, right? So 5th house is the digestive system to some extent, especially the intestines and all the like adjacent organs, the pancreas and I think the liver as well. Again, I'm not very strong in anatomy, but basically everything that helps with digestion. Not so much the stomach, which is more of the fourth house energy, but pretty much everything else, that's the fifth house, and also the cardiovascular system, the heart and the blood vessels and everything. So again, you might have a negative scenario that shows health problems connected to these areas, right, with the 12th house. And again, health problems that could be keeping you from getting good rest. Aside from this, the 12th house is also the house of, well, I think I've covered pretty much every aspect of spirituality. What I was going to say was it is the house of loss. And so because of that, any kind of thing that signifies the fifth house, right? So children, education, hobbies, things you do for fun, romantic partners, all of these things are more susceptible to loss in your case than, let's say, the average person, because you have this connection between the 5th and the 12th houses, especially as I have said in the beginning, especially when there's a lot of negativity surrounding these houses and the lords of the houses, right? So you could see some losses, some serious losses happening, especially when they are triggered by transits and or dashas. Also, the 5th house being connected to speculative gains, you should definitely steer clear of investing recklessly because it might definitely lead to losses. And aside from that, 12th house is also dealing with foreigners, import, export, right? So when you invest in these things, especially, you might be at risk of losing significant amounts of money. But again, I always stress this, you still have to look at the big picture, right? Because it will show you how bad the losses could get and when they're most likely to happen, like I said, based on transits and dashas. Another thing to take into account here is that 5th house, again, being connected to the partner, this could show that you, on the one hand, it also shows that you're likely to meet the partner in a faraway land or in something connected to religion, some circumstances connected to religion and or spirituality. But aside from that, this can also show that the partner will be forced somehow to go to faraway places, faraway lands, right? So again, there's that element of loss because there's just a lot of distance happening in between you and the romantic partner. But again, you would have to check more details to see if this is likely to happen. And okay, another thing to take into account with this placement, especially again if it's negative, is it is a placement that predisposes both you and your romantic partners to love affairs, secret affairs, right? Because the 12th house is about secret affairs, it's bed pleasures. So on the one hand, for you personally, it could show sometimes maybe a unhealthy attitude towards sexuality or towards affairs in general. So you might be tempted to step outside of relationships in order to have affairs. But the same thing could be said about your partner, the romantic partner, right? So there could be drama happening in romance because of these placements with a lot of secrecy and hush-hush, right? Another potentially negative impact here is that you might be particularly drawn to this element of secrecy, right? So you just like the drama. It's kind of like a turn on, right? To have a secret affair as opposed to having a normal, regular, out in the open relationship, right? Yeah, okay. This is pretty much what I can say about the placement of 5th house lord in the 12th house. And as a conclusion, I always want to mention this, bear in mind that you do have free will, and the main purpose of reading astrology and learning astrology is to learn to understand yourself better in order to anticipate potential obstacles and to try to either completely overcome them or at least minimize their impact, basically. And aside from that, of course, don't forget to watch the part 1, which is about the more negative expressions of the 5th house lord going through houses. Okay, so this is pretty much what I wanted to say, and thank you for listening one more time. And of course, if you have liked the video, feel free to like, subscribe to my channel if you haven't done so already. Click on the notifications bell to see when I post a new video, and comment in the comment section with anything you want to share, any feedback you would like to give. Also, if you want to find out more about memberships, check out the introductory part of the video. If you want to support my channel further, you can do so by becoming a member and or leaving a tip. And of course, clicking on the notifications bell, liking, commenting, sharing the videos, anything you can do to basically spread the word would really help a lot. And aside from that, of course, if you're interested in a private consultation, you can email me at the email address in the video description, and I can give you a list of prices and reading options and any other information you would be interested in. And of course, last but not least, I have a tarot channel, and I will be linking that in the video description as well. So if you want to check it out, go ahead, subscribe. It would help a great deal. Okay, thank you very much for listening, and I hope to see you at my next video. Bye.